Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will assume its consideration of Agenda Item 74, entitled Report of the International Criminal Court, to continue the debate on the item. I therefore give the floor to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente, agradecemos.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the President of the International Criminal Court for the presentation of the report contained in A/78/222 that we have taken due note of. And we were able to see in that report the legal activities put forward by that body in fulfillment of its mandate, including current cases underway, the conclusion of some, and the status of investigations underway. Mr. President, the Venezuelan state is firmly committed, both in its national legislation and in practice, to the respect, promotion, and protection of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And there we express our categorical rejection of all crimes committed against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and ethnic cleansing, all of which are set forth in the Rome Statutes. We also reiterate the key role played by states as a guarantor of fundamental rights for their people, and our further support for guaranteeing access to justice in those cases where such atrocious crimes have been committed, but always based on the premise of national jurisdiction having primacy. Venezuela reaffirms its firm commitment to the Rome Statutes and to fighting impunity, especially for crimes that are the most serious and internationally important. We believe that that is an unavoidable step, both for maintaining international peace and security and for strengthening the rule of law at the international level. Based on that commitment, we take this opportunity to first take note of the statements made by Prosecutor UNGA on the 29th of October, and secondly, to call for once and for all measures to be taken, urgently and concrete measures to be taken, including from the ICC, that Israel, the occupying power, be held accountable for the atrocious crimes that it has been committing for years with impunity in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that would include, throughout the last 3 weeks, another and regrettable spiral of violence, death, and destruction, which has cost the lives of thousands of civilian, innocent bystanders, including women and children, which can only be called, without making a mistake, a true genocide. Sir, in February of 2020, my country addressed the ICC for investigations to be conducted to investigate criminal responsibility of the members of the U.S. government who have perpetrated crimes of international importance against the Venezuelan people, with the application of a cruel and inhuman economic financial blockade and embargo which prevents our people from having access to food and medicine. Through the systematic and intentional use of this embargo, it has become clearly a crime against humanity, according to Article 7 of the Rome Statutes. This is a whole series of unilateral coercive measures which violate the United Nations Charter and all norms of international law, and that are clearly geared to depriving all of the Venezuelan people from their means of subsistence. We await with interest the quick beginning of investigation into the case called the Venezuelan case. Despite our clear and manifest commitment to the Rome Statutes and the principles contained therein, and our actions of 3 years and our growing collaboration with the Karinkan office. Despite all of that, we have to recognize it, as is natural. On some occasions, there have been some discrepancies with the vision of the court or the prosecutor of the court when it adopted some of its decisions. However, that has not prevented us from continuing to cooperate and communicate in a fluid manner with the court. To the contrary, throughout the last few years, we have been strengthening our dialogue with the prosecutor's office of the ICC, and based on the recent signing in June of a memorandum of understanding by which we establish a framework for opening an office of the prosecutor of the court in our country to provide technical assistance and to support the Venezuelan legislative efforts, which are geared to establishing the truth and providing justice. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, on the 14th of August 2023, at the Appeals Court of the International Criminal Court, presented the basis of its case with regard to its appealing the preliminary findings, and through which was authorized a resumption of the investigation in the case called Venezuela 1. In the appeal, my country argued that on the 27th of June of 2023, there were errors in fact and in law in the report and the findings, misinterpreting international law and the Rome Statute, and therefore the result was contrary to justice and truth. With the presentation of our appeal, my country hopes that attachment will be shown to international law. According with our national constitution, Venezuela is a democratic and social state of law and justice. We therefore demand respect of our constitutional system of justice, and we also take this opportunity to recall that since at least 2018, we have been denouncing the process that was begun by a group of countries before the court, which is clearly politically motivated and can be inscribed in the strategy of trying to bring about a regime change. It involves foreign intervention in Venezuelan affairs based on false accusations and supposed crimes against humanity, something that has never happened in my country. In that context, it's worthwhile bringing to the attention of this General Assembly what was said by the ministers of foreign affairs of the non-aligned movement countries during its most recent meeting in July in Azerbaijan with regard to this question. And I quote, they said, "We note with concern the recent decision handed down by the International Criminal Court to proceed with an investigation into the presumed crimes committed under its jurisdiction in Venezuela based on the demonstrated cooperation with the ICC in this regard and the proceedings currently underway in Venezuela in exercise of its national jurisdiction and in keeping with its national obligations and international obligations as relevant." We further stress that this action is in violation of the principle of complementarity as set forth in the Rome Statutes, and therefore we request the ICC to avoid allowing its work to be politicized or used, and that would include as part of the loafer efforts or legal war, which just serves to promote specific agendas and undermine efforts to preserve the integrity of the Rome Statutes and the independence of the court, end of quote. Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela reaffirms that the International Criminal Court is a court of last instance, and it establishes justice for serious international crimes rooted in national courts. National authorities, therefore, have the major responsibility of investigating and trying crimes which are defined as crimes in the Rome statutes. The court is involved, the ICC is involved only when states are not prepared to or cannot act within their jurisdiction to undertake the national proceedings that correspond to them. I would like to conclude by emphasizing that my country, through the public ministry, which in addition to guaranteeing respect for constitutional guarantees and judicial proceedings, organizes criminal cases and proceedings when crimes have been committed, has been undertaking a series of reforms. It has adopted a series of innovative measures to ensure effective justice be served on national territory, and always seeking to provide reparations to potential victims of human rights violations. All of this is in full compliance with our national and international obligations in this area, and those that would include those that stem from the Rome statutes, and in full correspondence with the spirit of cooperation, the memorandum of understanding undersigned between the ICC and my country. Moreover, we take this opportunity to recognize the work of public defenders who work at the ICC, whose efforts are fundamental to guarantee the proper functioning of the court. And we would also like to express our grave concern given the current labor situation of those public servants, and we therefore urge the government of the Netherlands, in its capacity as host of the ICC, to recognize their condition and return to the prior situation, prior to 2014, whereby the taxation was similar to this other civil servants of the ICC in equal conditions. We also call for preservation of the objectivity, independence, non-selectivity, and impartiality and transparency of the work of the court. And we should avoid that it be used to advance dark political interests that run against the spirit of the Rome Statute and that undermine both the primacy of justice and human rights. Along these ideas, we conclude by rejecting in the most categorical terms the recent statement made by the United States in this very room 2 days ago. That statement shows once again the double standard applied in the area of human rights and its reiterated interest in politicizing the work of the ICC, whose judges and prosecutors have even been sanctioned due to the simple fact that they have tried to undertake investigations which are geared at specifically doing what other situations require, which is to provide justice and accountability for atrocious crimes. It's unthinkable, Mr. President, to try and supposedly promote great causes around the world while at the same time one chooses to turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by one's own nationals around the world, and then continue perpetuating over time impunity and a framework of impunity for the social genocide and oppression of an entire other people. This is not moral, and they do not stand on the moral high ground to make such statements about my country. It's enough to see so much shamelessness by the government of the United States and its satellites. It is time, therefore, to have justice and truth. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and I now invite the distinguished representative of El Salvador to take the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The Republic of El Salvador thanks the President for presenting the annual report on the work of the International Criminal Court. And with regard to the report, El Salvador would like to make the following remarks. The creation of the International Criminal Court was a crucial step in the evolution of international criminal law. This court reflects the commitment of the international community to guarantee that those crimes that are the most serious for the international community as a whole not enjoy impunity. 25 years after adopting the Rome Statute for the ICC, El Salvador takes note of the work of this important court in international criminal justice. We urge preservation, always, the institution as one that is permanent, independent, and of universal vocation. We further urge respect of the principle of complementarity in national jurisdictions. This principle makes it possible for the ICC to intervene when states cannot or are not prepared to try those who are responsible for serious crimes. In this regard, my delegation acknowledges that complementarity is essential to guarantee that there is no space for impunity and to adopt measures which are key for the protection of witnesses and victims. Mr. President, the relationship between the International Criminal Court and the United Nations is fundamental. The United Nations is the cornerstone of international cooperation, and the ICC has become a key and essential part of that structure. In that regard, my delegation takes note of the presentation of the reports A/78/322 on the work of the court in the years 2022 and 2023. We also take note of report A/78/321 on the expenditures and reimbursements received by the United Nations with regard to assistance provided to the ICC. We take note also of report A/78/320, which contains information which is relevant to application of Article 3 of the relationship agreement between the United Nations and the International Criminal Court. El Salvador encourages the promotion of capacity building in programs for legal reform and judicial reform supported by the United Nations in order to strengthen the institutional capacity and technical capacity of states parties to the Rome Statute, and also to train legal professionals geared to investigation and prosecution of international crimes. Capacity building clearly will make it possible to exercise the vital responsibility of states parties to the statutes to be able to investigate and try those crimes that are defined in the Rome Statute. And then, therefore, we believe it's opportune and very timely, the recommendations set forth in paragraph 71 of the report A/78/322 in this area. Mr. President, we conclude reiterating my country's commitment to continue reviewing this item of the agenda, and we would also like to join in the co-sponsorship of the resolution that will be adopted after the plenary debate has been concluded. We will continue to provide follow-up to the work of the court that will make it possible to guarantee in its fulfillment access to international criminal justice so that it is respected and put in practice in a way that is lasting and in a way that prioritizes protection of human dignity of victims. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to deliver her statement.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, a number of delegations have spoken here in this room about those lofty ideals, combating impunity and equality of all before the law. We support these principles. They're the right ones. Historically, my country has championed these principles. It was one of the countries behind the Nuremberg Tribunal. Russia was one of the most active participants in the development of the ICC's Rome Statute. We voted in favor of its adoption, we signed it, and we even began ratifying it. Like many others, back then, we genuinely believed that this court, the ICC, can continue the glorious legacy of the tribunals which were established following World War II with a view to condemning Nazi and militaristic criminals. The ICC was supposed to investigate the most serious crimes under international law. It was supposed to do so impartially and effectively. very high hopes were pinned on the court by many. Most of the effusive language contained in the resolution we're considering today dates back to the first few years after the ICC was established. Back then, commendatory reviews were often given in advance, and yet they have little to do with the current situation at the ICC and around it. Time and practice have shown that the lofty ideals of justice were not destined to become reality. Hopes, it turns out, were far removed from reality. The trajectory of the ICC's development, or rather of its degradation, was very similar to the dubious achievements of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is famous for its clear anti-Serbian bent in its guilty verdicts. It's also known for whitewashing war criminals, including true butchers from a number of parties to the conflict. And it's only now that exotic courts of some sort established by the European Union, it's only now that they've started looking into these criminals. The ICC's main achievement is that it managed to outdo the odious ICTY in terms of how selective, partial, and politicized its work is. It's also excelled in brushing under the carpet the war crimes committed by its Western masters. Already back in Yugoslavia, Hague justice was a dirty word, and it's taken on new meaning thanks to the ICC. The ICC managed to refute the idea that combating impunity was a guarantee of reconciliation and conflict resolution down the line. The situation in Sudan and Libya is an excellent example of this. Experiments to transfer these situations to the ICC, these dossiers to the ICC, were not only unsuccessful, they meant a catastrophe for these countries, which stretched out over many years. Over the time that the ICC has been doing its useless work, we have a pathetic handful of decisions. The final verdict, well, you can count the number of final verdicts on one hand, on the fingers of one hand. Many cases simply fell apart at the investigations stage, and billions of dollars were spent on these less than impressive results. The ICC's regular budget, a punitive machine wielded by the collective West, its budget is 3 times higher than that of the International Court of Justice. And this is without counting the hundreds of millions of dollars which Western countries funneled into that sham Ukraine case in the guise of voluntary contributions. Against this backdrop, the ICC's regular attempts to justify in front of the Security Council its flagrant years-long ineffectiveness on Libya and the Darfur justify this because it doesn't have sufficient financial resources. Well, that's a pitiful excuse. And yet, the West has certainly got bang for its buck. Since the ICC was established, 52 persons were charged. 47 of them were from Africa. That's a very interesting statistic, given that the worst, the bloodiest mass atrocities in modern-day history were committed by the West. An African colleague referred to the ICC as the International Colonial Court, and it wasn't in jest. The ICC has degenerated into a truly political tool for prosecuting those who have crossed the West. The neocolonialists, meanwhile, are enjoying total impunity, regardless of what they do, and this is in the best traditions of the so-called rules-based order instead of the law-based order. And examples abound. This court and its pet prosecutor, a British national, well, the West simply had to snap its fingers, and the court deprioritized an investigation of civilians dying at the hands of NATO, including women and children. Similar situations in Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of victims, and yet no one is held responsible. That's the justice you get at The Hague. And in a similar fashion, the ICC is making up cases as soon as its Western patrons tell it to. For instance, the arrest warrant issued against Mr. Gaddafi, which was cooked up in a matter of 3 days. These were shameful instances. Cases are fabricated against states which are not to the liking of the Western patrons of the ICC. The Gaddafi case was so outrageous that even the test tube wielded by Mr. Powell at the UN Security Council pales in comparison. And yet the ICC did its job. It dehumanized the Libyan leader, creating a fig leaf for the NATO aggression in the country. As a result, the country and its economy lie in ruins. Mr. Gaddafi was killed, and no one was held to account for this. Many perished from NATO bombs. Hundreds of thousands of people went up in flames during the Civil War, a war of all against all. Many drowned at sea, heading to Europe, looking for a better life. Or some did make it ashore and saw outrageous discrimination and inhumane treatment on the part of those who destroyed their home country. And who has been held responsible for this? We see total impunity at the ICC. So-called arrest warrants were issued for a number of Russians hastily just before the Russia-China summit. And this was a shameful circus. It doesn't have anything to do with justice. And the pretrial chamber actually had to replace the judge very quickly. In fact, when the prosecutor sent his request to the court, to the chamber's composition had been finalized. But who cares about procedural norms when you have political orders to execute? The prosecutor got his bonus, by the way. Just a few days before he sent his request to the ICC, his younger brother was released from prison. This was early release. His brother was a former British MP who was serving time because of a paedophilia crime. The issuance of warrants happened days before the donor conference in support of the ICC in London, and the sponsors there said that all of the money they were pledging should be spent exclusively on holding Russia to account. In other words, interested parties are paying for the proceedings they commission. Just think about this. What justice is there to speak of? The charges brought against Russians, that's a whole other issue. Not only are they groundless, there are violations of international law on the immunity of state officials. They're nugatory in legal terms and inhumane. These Russians are being accused of evacuating children who'd been left to their own devices from an area where hostilities are underway. So if we follow the ICC's logic, we should have left these children in the line of fire. This is how the ICC believes justice should be done. Against this backdrop, it comes as no surprise the ICC's position and the position of its patrons regarding the tragic events which have been ongoing now for 3 weeks. The civilian population has not been evacuated from the area where hostilities are underway. Thousands of children have died owing to indiscriminate shelling. Hospitals are being shelled regularly. Patients, doctors, and emergency workers are being buried under the rubble. Hundreds of people are suffering due to lack of water and medicine. Some UN system agencies have woken up and have started talking about possible war crimes. Where is the much wanted ICC? Where are the arrest wardrants? Or are those issued only when you save children, not when you kill them? The office of the British prosecutor is making some general political pronouncements, threatening taking Palestinians only to court. This again demonstrates the true nature of the ICC, its ideals, the purposes it pursues, and the interests, whose interests it's serving. Thus, the ICC's attempts to position itself as a body acting on behalf of the international community that look simply silly. The idea that has an international generally recognized mandate has nothing to do with reality. It's divorced with reality. This is a pseudo-court. And in fact, over 1/3 of UN member states are not members of it. They represent over 50% of the Earth's population. Many have been compelled to stay at the ICC because they've been threatened. So we've had an overview of the ICC's work. Let's compare this situation, this unsightly picture, with the draft resolution. The document has been frozen since 2016. Any links to reality were severed long before. In 2011, this pseudo-court signed its own death sentence when it came up with those fakes regarding Mr. Gaddafi. Most of the positive assessments of the ICC's work were included in the resolution back then when it was being established, before it had started its work. In fact, this is probably the only golden days the ICC has known in its history. Aside from the scandalous exterior, the situation within the court is just as problematic. It's completely opaque. The elections process is dubious, and there is no equal geographical representation. All of the top positions are invariably occupied by Westerners and their satellites. They're doing everything within their power to stop developing countries succeeding to the helm of this repressive political instrument wielded by the West to fight against those who are not to their liking. Another issue is the link within the resolution between the ICC and the UN. It does nothing for the credibility of the UN. The panegyric resolution under the GA's consideration stopped reflecting reality long ago, including because showing the true state of play in the text is simply impossible because of the implacable position of pro-ICC activists. This is what the ICC has degenerated into. And we do not intend to live with this text, even in its frozen form, any longer. We don't want the GA to remain hostage to idealistic views, which have been refuted by reality over the course of the ICC's 20-year decay. We demand to put the draft resolution to a vote. We call on all states which are not indifferent to genuinely combating impunity, who are in favor of equality and the sovereign equality of states in particular, to join us in voting against this resolution. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for his statement and now invite the observer state of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. In all of 2022, across all conflict areas around the world combined, around 3,000 children were killed. 3,000 too many. In 3 weeks, Israel killed 3,600 Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip, more than all the children killed in all conflict areas in a year. Of the 8,800 Palestinians killed so far, more than 70% are children and women. Nearly all are civilians. Is there anyone here, anyone with a shred of humanity and decency, that thinks there is any justification for that? Anyone here that believes these numbers are possible if Israel was not targeting civilians, or at the very least, conducting indiscriminate attacks? The rules of international law came in response to tragedies we failed to prevent. We remember the names of these tragedies. They are the names of towns, cities, provinces, forever etched in our collective memory as open wounds, as stains on humanity's conscience, as reminders of what happens when the worst occurs and the many remain silent. In that list, Gaza's name is in bold. It appears several times. For the decades of military occupation, for 16 years of blockade, for 5 wars, and now more than ever, for 3 weeks, where the Gaza Strip has been besieged and bombed with no regard for the life of 2.3 million Palestinians who live there. The international community has failed those who were killed. It is failing the besieged, the wounded, the sick, the displaced. But thousands of lives hang in the balance. They can still be saved. There is no way to describe what Israel is doing in the Gaza Strip as anything else than war crimes. Let me reformulate. There is no way to describe what is happening as anything less than war crimes. If you recognize these acts are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, these are crimes against humanity. If you recognize they are committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national group, then they are genocide. These are the choices: genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. Which one does any country here wants to try and justify? Is there any country still ready to evoke unconditional support for Israel while it is committing these atrocities, while it is occupying, colonizing, besieging, killing, and maiming. As member states of the United Nations, you pledged unconditional support to the UN Charter, to the rule of international law. Every nation has to choose where its loyalty lies. What is clear is that support for Israel in this war is incompatible with that pledge, with your obligation to uphold international law. International law, as a leading humanitarian NGO puts it, the humanitarian rule book has been thrown out, and polite pleas from politicians to minimize civilian fatalities are naive at best, and at worst seem blind to the unimaginable horrors already taking place in Gaza. International law is the standard against which all our actions are measured. Condoning double standards can only undermine and jeopardize the credibility and rule of international law. No exceptionalism for Israel, and no exception for Palestine and the Palestinian people. You know how what is happening in Palestine now is possible? One wonders, looking at these images, how is this possible? Not for one day, not for two, for days and weeks now. Live on TV screens being broadcasted around the world, massacres taking place. You know how it is possible? Read the Rome Statute. It has all the answers. It states, determined to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes, and thus contribute to the prevention of such crimes. Impunity leads to recurrence of crimes. 75 years, not a single Israeli leader or commander or soldier has been held accountable for the crimes committed against the Palestinian people. Not one. We joined the ICC almost 10 years ago and still await for justice to be delivered. There were countries to oppose us joining the ICC. There were countries to oppose the General Assembly seizing the International Court of Justice. How can they explain why Israel can never be held accountable in any form or any forum? This is not what history taught us. It taught us that our best chance against horrors is for the law to be upheld, for justice to be ensured, regardless of the identity of their victims and regardless of the identity of the perpetrators. That there is no justification whatsoever for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide. None. The Israeli permanent representative stood in the Security Council and placed a yellow star on his jacket, evoking the Holocaust, while at the same time justifying the bombings that are killing Palestinian civilians by the thousands, children by the thousands. No one can instrumentalize the Holocaust to justify atrocities. No one. We honor the victims of the Holocaust and all victims by never justifying the killing of innocent civilians, by upholding international law for all. The Holocaust was one of the worst horrors humanity ever witnessed, and with other horrors led us to elaborate the very rules that are being breached today. The Charter, the Geneva Convention, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. It led us to adopt the Rome Statute 50 years too late and build a court with a universal calling, not for one group against another, but for all humanity. Are we not part of that human family? Are Palestinian civilian lives less sacred? Does anyone here agree with Israel that we are subhumans? During each statement delivered here, every 5 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. When we say every minute counts, we mean it. It's the difference between life and death for hundreds of people, for thousands of people. Palestinian families have lost 10, 20, 30, 40 of their relatives, killed en masse, several generations at a time. Some have disappeared from the face of the earth. You have families. You have grandparents and parents and siblings and children and grandchildren. Think of them. And then think of a single Palestinian family that have lost all of them, or of the child that survived all of the rest of his family and who has to go through life with that reality. Hundreds of Palestinian families have lost more than 10 members of their family. Nothing can justify this war going on for a single minute. Nothing. We have 2,000 Palestinians under the rubble. We can't reach them, can't save those who could still be saved, can't bury those who were killed. A mother said she could still hear her child under the rubble. She will never know if he could have been saved or not. She will never know. Never again means never standing idly by while atrocities are committed. It means never justifying such atrocities under any pretense or pretext. It means standing up to them and standing up for those enduring them. The General Assembly adopted a resolution grounded in morality and legality, calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, for upholding international humanitarian law and the protection of all civilians, for humanitarian access and aid to the Palestinian people throughout the Gaza Strip, for release of civilians held captive, for stopping and reversing forced transfer of population, for accountability, and for peace. We appreciate all those who voted in favor of that resolution and call on them to spare no effort to ensure its implementation. And we call on those who did not vote in favor of this resolution to review their untenable position. We appreciate every effort to get humanitarian aid in. We appreciate every effort to allow to save lives. But the only way for us to address this catastrophic situation underway is to stop the assault immediately. We call on the prosecutor who made an important visit to the region in the midst of this unfolding tragedy to uphold his mandate, and all states to help ensure accountability. We need your unconditional support to civilians, including children, to the humanitarian personnel performing in impossible conditions. 67 of UNRWA staff have been killed. Many doctors, many rescue teams have been bombarded. Many hospitals, many schools are under the bombs. There's no safe haven, no safe place in Gaza. People are asked to go south, and the south is under the bombs. 40% of those killed were killed in the south. Don't believe the lies. There is nothing called an evacuation order to protect civilians. Israel has admitted in this memo of the Ministry of Intelligence that the goal was the forced displacement of people outside of the Gaza Strip, outside of Palestine. The same goal pursued over 75 years. We have 75 years of experience to know Israeli goals. It is not to protect our civilians. It has never been to protect our civilians. It has always been to dispossess and displace our people. This is an unlawful order. Nobody should justify it. The protection follows the civilians. It's not the civilians who run after protection. They should be protected wherever they are. This order is a death sentence for many who cannot leave where they are. There is no shelters, no infrastructure to receive them. There is not a single safe place in Gaza. We need your unconditional support to the wounded and the sick, to the law, to humanity, to a reality where no Palestinians are killed and no Israelis are killed, where our rights are no longer denied, where families are reunited in life, not death, where we are all able to live in peace and security. Only one path can lead us there. No one should obstruct it. All should help us on it. It is the one we identified when we joined the ICC with 3 simple words: justice, not vengeance. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/78L6 entitled Report of the International Criminal Court. For your information, the draft resolution has closed for e-sponsorship. I now give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat.
Mr. President, I should like to announce that since the submission of the draft resolution, and in addition to the delegation listed on the L document, the foreign countries have also become co-sponsors of A/78/L6. Albania, Andorra, Argentina, Australia, Austria, Barbados, Belgium, Belize, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Botswana, Bulgaria, Cabo Verde, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Estonia, Fiji, Finland, France, Gambia, Georgia, Germany, Ghana, Greece, Guatemala, Honduras, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Madagascar, Malawi, Malta, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Montenegro, New Zealand, Nigeria, North Macedonia, Norway, Paraguay, Peru, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Samoa, San Marino, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Trinidad and Tobago, Uganda, Ukraine, United Kingdom, United Republic of Tanzania, and Uruguay. If any other countries wish to co-sponsor A/78/L6, please signify by pressing the microphone button. I see Gabon, if the delegation of Gabon turn off the microphone button unless there is any other change. And I see Congo. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Secretariat. A recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/78/L6, please signify. Those against? Abstentions.
The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/78/L6 entitled Report of the International Criminal Court. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
Ready? The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 115. Against, 6. Abstentions, 31. Draft resolution A/78/L6 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Brazil.
Mr. President, as I mentioned during the debate, the difficulty to achieve consensus for the first time in this annual resolution highlights the need for us to reflect on how we may overcome the current pressing challenges faced by the International Criminal Court, rather than simply disregarding them. And this is why Brazil has chosen to abstain. Achieving universal adherence, addressing concerns related to partiality, selectivity, and double standards, ensuring effective state cooperation, fostering coherence within the international legal system, and rectifying geographical imbalances within the ICC's institutional structure are some of these critical challenges. It is essential that the ICC conducts a thorough self-assessment of its current activities as outlined in its annual report, addressing these and other concerns to further its noble mission of ending the impunity for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. In closing, Mr. President, allow me to reiterate Brazil's unwavering commitment to international law and international justice as underscored in my remarks during this debate. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished delegate of Brazil, and I now invite the distinguished delegate of Israel to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel was an early advocate for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. However, Israel has decided to abstain for the reason it has expressed in previous years when it disassociated itself from this resolution. As a democratic state based on the rule of law, and as the nation of the state of the Jewish people, we remain committed to ensuring that the perpetrators of mass atrocities that deeply shocked and conscious of humanity are held accountable. In that context, Israel has already stated that it has launched a national investigation in relation to the barbaric and ongoing crimes committed by Hamas against Israeli children, women, and men in a murderous terror attack that started on October 7th, 2023, and will seek to hold those responsible to account. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Israel for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished delegate of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my delegation chose to join the states that voted against the draft resolution and the states that clearly expressed how dismayed they are from the unprecedented politicization of the performance of the ICC. My country was among the states that effectively participated in the Rome Conference in 1998 and contributed in an important manner in the drafting of the statute of the court. We were among the first states to sign the statute of the court. However, the stumbling performance and the selective approach by the ICC since it was established was the reason for not signing the statute, despite the fact that the work of the committee was simultaneously aligned with some of the most heinous and serious crimes committed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and occupied Palestine. The record of the court was full of failures of betraying the victims of the Iraq and the Afghanistan invasions, as well as the violations by Israel, the victims of Abu Ghraib, among others. Today, 25 years after the adoption of the statute of the court, we became confident that we were right to take that position against the court and not to ratify its statute. Mr. President, it is truly regrettable for us to see the fact that the that the court has been taken hostage by directives from Western states, including the United States, that have ratified the statute, and to draft decisions and legislations to obstruct the work of the court. We all remember the ASDA, the Act to Protect the servicemen of the United States, known as the Lehigh Service Law. Have these states rediscovered the court, or along with their Western allies decided to redefine the court by turning it into a tool to bring pressure to bear and to bring coercive diplomacy in the face of certain states? These states are, by coincidence, African states. What a coincidence. Most of the countries that were targeted were African states, as if those gross violations are a trademark of African leaders. This has happened despite the fact that history taught us otherwise. History taught us that the most heinous crimes committed in Africa were perpetrated by the West and continues to perpetrate it against Africa and the peaceful people of Africa. Things did not stop there. The court has turned recently, or the speaker says, started issuing subpoenas on demand, international subpoenas on demand. And this is a new service. These are new customer services. And even if these subpoenas were to face senior officials from non-member states, this is against the rules of international law on sovereignty, personal and otherwise, agreed upon by customary law and confirmed by the decisions of the International Court of Justice. In full view of the world and on TV screens, we witness an act of genocide that continues against a whole people in Gaza. Where is the criminal court while all of this is taking place? The court decided to remain silent or only to make declarations. The court decided to stand idly by while children are killed, where hospitals are targeted, and even those who are already dead are targeted. This is exactly the position that was clearly understood due to the court's position towards Palestine. As for encouraging member states to adhere to the court, it would be tantamount to being asked to be partners to the crime and to remain silent while these crimes are committed. Most of the leaders and the Israeli war criminals who clearly declare that they are determined to annihilate civilians, to destroy Gaza, and to deal with the Gaza people as human animals, all of those, I say, have citizenships of member states in the court. All of those, I repeat, have citizenships of countries in the court in addition to their own. And this is against the court's statute in rule number 12. So why won't these states who claim to be protecting international justice, why don't they submit them to the court? Why doesn't this apply to ISIS? Because most of the ISIS members are citizens of these states. My answer is because this does not serve the interests of these states that are partners in the crimes committed by the Israeli occupation and those of ISIS. We do not exaggerate when we say that silence by the court towards the crimes in Gaza makes the court a partner in the crime. And it is a partner because it did not move. It was a partner when it divided the Sudan, in destroying Libya, and in failing the victims of Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and Afghanistan. In conclusion, sir, what I said before are not claims. Those are facts confirmed by history. And therefore, talking about the universality of international criminal law, which the court is supposed to be representing, or that is what it was supposed to have represented, is something that includes an exaggeration. We might be better off admitting that the selective performance and the systematic targeting that now guide the work of the court has ridden the concept of international justice from credibility, and therefore we are now with the justice of the victors, of those who took revenge, and those who financed. Thank you.
May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 74?
Israel is asking for the floor.
The Chair recognizes the distinguished delegation of Israel.
Thank you, Chair. We regret that once again the Palestinian delegate has chosen to exploit this esteemed platform and exhaust its vulnerable time.
Would you ask?
Would the delegate of Israel please indicate whether the statement he is in the process of making constitutes a right of reply?
We want to have a right of reply, Mr. President.
The exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I now call on the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. We regret that once again the Palestinian delegate has chosen to exploit this esteemed platform and exhaust its valuable time by sharing misleading information and inflate numbers, seemingly running out of valid legal arguments. We should all remember there is no law without facts, and the facts are very clear. Hamas, the genocidal terrorist organization, started this war, and Israel has the legal and the moral right to protect its citizens, period. Hamas is the ruler of Gaza Strip. Hamas is behind this attack, and it will be held accountable for the ramifications of its actions, period. In this asymmetric lawfare, everything is asymmetric. There is one side, a democratic state, which abides by the international law and does everything within its power to minimize civilian casualties, and on the other side, there is a genocidal terror organization which blatantly ignores and violates international law time and again, and strives to maximize the civilian casualties on the Israeli side as well as on the Palestinian side. If the Palestinian delegate and their supporters' concerns are genuinely for the well-being of Palestinians in Gaza, we suggest they address Hamas, which hides in the tunnels under hospitals and whose actions and use of civilians as human shields significantly impacts the situation on the ground. The right thing to do is to condemn Hamas. If they won't condemn Hamas, as they haven't been refusing to do since the massacre on October 7th, perhaps it would be better if this forum would focus on developing the international law rather than being influenced by those who wish to spread false information and political agendas. Thank you, Mr. President.
May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 74? It is so decided. Members are reminded that the 43rd plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session will be held immediately after the adjournment of this meeting. The meeting is adjourned. The 43rd plenary meeting of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. Is empty. The General Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled Illegal Israeli Actions in Occupied East Jerusalem and the Rest of the Occupied Palestinian Territory, to resume the debate on the item pursuant to the decision taken at the 40th plenary meeting on 27th October 2023. Can I encourage delegates to, if you need to consult, can you do so outside the room so that we can hear the delegates who will make presentations this afternoon? I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, the ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to salute you using the greetings of Islam, the religion of peace and mercy. Peace be upon you, so is God's and His blessings. Allow me to begin by extending our deep respect and gratitude to the 121 states that honorably stated their position last Friday and decided not to stand idly by while genocide and collective punishment were visited upon our defenseless civilian Palestinian brothers. Please do not forget that on the same day when you decided to stand by what you deemed as right and made your positions known, challenged criminality, atrocities, and heinous crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces, they declared the start of their ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. They did not stop there. They doubled their strikes and bloodthirsty violence against innocent civilians who were mostly women and children who committed no sin to deserve this fate. Does the world still believe that what has been unfolding is in self-defense? Are there among you those who continue to remain indifferent in the face of an unfolding genocide playing live daily before your very eyes? Do you accept that an occupation entity unilaterally rides roughshod over the rules and principles of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law? I just wonder how audacious are those who turn a blind eye to atrocities and fail to condemn them. You dragged this organization to an abyss the likes of which we have never seen before because of your double standards and selectivity in applying the law. Mr. President, Kuwait's position vis-à-vis the crimes committed before our own eyes is based on three basic principles. First, an immediate ceasefire. Second, opening border crossings and providing urgent access for relief humanitarian assistance supplies. Third, rejecting any attempt to initiate or initiative to forcefully displace the Palestinian people to areas outside their occupied territories. On the application of law, I would review with you the actions of the coward occupation forces violating the interests of civilians. And I say coward because this is against because of the actions of the Israeli forces, who have no sin other than they were created Palestinians. We see daily violations of the principles of international law, international humanitarian law, in addition to many decisions and resolutions adopted by the Security Council and the General Assembly, the countless decisions. So I would like to review with you the violations against the civilians. Some of the most difficult scenes that we are seeing daily is killing innocent children, young children who only hope to go to schools to play with each other. They have committed no crime whatsoever. And I would like to draw your attention here to the statements declared made by Save the Children 2 days ago, to the effect that the number of children killed in Gaza in the past 3 weeks alone exceeded the annual number of children killed all over conflict zones in the world since 2019. Over 3,257 children have been killed since October 7. Let's review together some of the resolutions by the Security Council that are daily violated by the occupying authorities for the past 25 days. First, Security Council Resolutions 1261 of 1999. It was the first resolution of its kind to be tabled before the Security Council, condemning targeting children in armed conflict, forcibly displacing them, attacking targets protected under international law, including in areas in which children are present in large numbers. In addition to guaranteeing access by humanitarian officers and providing humanitarian assistance in a safe and complete manner without any obstruction to children affected by armed conflicts. The resolution also stresses the importance of the safety, freedom of movement, and security of UN staff and associated staff, and stressing the responsibility by all states to put an end to impunity and to their commitment to bring those responsible for the gross violations of the 1949 conventions to justice. Second, Security Council Resolution 1998 of 2011. This resolution condemns attacks against schools and hospitals and obstructing access to humanitarian assistance by parties to armed conflicts and other violations of international law against children in cases of international conflict. Third, Security Council Resolution 2286 of 2016, which condemns acts of violence, strikes, and threats against those who've been injured, who are sick, medical crews, and those who provide humanitarian assistance, who are exclusively undertaking medical tasks, and against their means of transport and equipment, as well as against hospitals and other medical facilities. Fourth, Security Council Resolution 2347 of 2017 that condemns the destruction of cultural heritage represented in destroying religious sites in armed conflicts. Fifth, Security Council Resolution 2417 of 2018, which calls upon all parties to armed conflicts to commit to international humanitarian law, including the basic stuff and services that are indispensable for the sustained livelihoods of civilians, and to respect those who work in providing humanitarian assistance and other foodstuffs for relief purposes. Sixth, Security Council Resolution 2475 of 2019. The resolution urges all parties to conflicts to undertake measures according to international law and to commit to protecting civilians, including persons with disabilities, to prevent violence and acts of aggression committed against civilians in cases of armed conflict. Seventh, Security Council Resolution 2573 of 2021, which condemns attacks in cases of armed conflicts against civilians or civilian targets, and also arbitrary strikes or disproportionate strikes that lead to depriving civilians from the stuff that they definitely need to remain alive. Considering such acts and violations, gross violations of international humanitarian law, and calls upon all parties to armed conflicts to cease fire, to exercise ceasefire against civilians. Please forgive me for having spoken at length. However, I think that we are at a stage where we have to start talking about all Israeli violations in all of our meetings. The misinformation campaigns by the occupation authorities require that we respond with unrefutable facts. It has become clear that when the word of what's right and justice pains them, and the fact that the people of the world stood beside the Palestinians is something that terrorizes them. Therefore, we stress the need for the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions on the protection of civilians, where such resolutions include uncontroversial languages, and therefore it's illogical for us not to implement them today. It's as if those who drafted these resolutions would know the criminal acts that will pursue in the future, and such resolutions seem as if they were custom-made to respond to the gross violations perpetrated by the occupation forces. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, what the Secretary General said pained them when he said that what happened in Gaza on the 7th of October was not born out of a vacuum. So they started attacking him, asking him to resign, and they declared that he's not welcome to enter to their occupied entity. I would like to tell you, Mr. Guterres, you are the moral compass of this organization. We have only listened to arguments that highlight what is right, no matter how bitter the facts were. You should be welcome to any place on earth, any place that does not fear the words of rights, justice, and honesty. This only confirms what we already know. That is, this occupying power does not know what honesty is, what right is, and only promotes empty words and fabrications. The times has come, and we will not repeat what we have said over the last 56 years. The violation, killing, and violence perpetrated by the occupier has no place in our world today. Our only way forward would be the achievement of a full and comprehensive peace by the implementation of resolutions adopted in international contexts and the agreement to the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 for the establishment of the State of Palestine, with Jerusalem as its capital on the lines of June 4th of 1967. We are all for the above. Therefore, we are not going to go back to where we were, to square one. The time has already passed. This is not because we refuse to address the situation. The world knows that the state of Palestine did not reject political negotiations. However, ignoring international legitimacies according to the interests and to the changes in views of those who are in command on the other side is something that we will not accept, and we will not ignore. We are states, and we have our own influence. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you the following. You tried everything. You you would like, I would like to say to the occupying power, you were treacherous, you fought, you struck, you killed, you forced populations out, you displaced, you detained, and you imprisoned. You burnt everything before you. You only have one choice, which is the only choice that would rid us from this circle of violence that you have imposed for the past 56 years, which is to end occupation and to leave the Palestinian occupied territories. Our heart is broken. Our blood is boiling. Get out of our land. Leave our land. We don't regret your departure. In conclusion, our Palestinian brothers, you are free, you are the people of steadfastness and of struggle. We take pride in you, in your steadfastness and your courage. That is unprecedented. We will make every effort to show that you are in the right, and we will spare no effort to stand by your side. You are an inspiration. You have been the symbol of dignity, and I hope that you would be protected and peace be upon you, my distinguished delegates.
أشكر المندوب الدائم لدولة
I thank the permanent representative of the state of Kuwait, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
President, distinguished colleagues, the events of the last few weeks in the area of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have left probably no one on this earth indifferent. All of our hearts ache as we look at the heart-rending stories of human suffering. And the parties are shifting blame for the suffering from one to the next, while the civilians in Israel and Palestine continue to perish. Our mission receives tens of messages every day from Israeli citizens, Palestinians, and the diaspora. These people write to us about their loved ones in the conflict zone, urging us to do something, anything, to put an end to the violence. First and foremost, they are calling for a ceasefire, for hostages to be released. They're calling for the necessary humanitarian assistance to be delivered. These are thousands of horrendous individual stories, thousands of lives. I'd like to use the opportunity afforded by this rostrum to assure all those who have messaged us, who have contacted us, to assure them that we hear your pleas and we're doing everything within our power so that the international community can take steps to resolve this most acute crisis. We'd like to stress yet again that the violence visited upon civilians, Israeli civilians, since the start of October has no justification. We categorically repudiate and condemn them, all terrorist acts. We extend our condolences to all those who lost loved ones in Israel, Palestine, and in other countries. We demand the release of all persons held captive. Unfortunately, this tragedy didn't appear out of thin air. The protracted Israeli-Palestinian conflict was and remains at the epicenter of all Middle Eastern upheavals. For over 70 years, the Palestinian issue has remained unresolved, and it has prompted regional and international divergences of opinion. It's been exploited as an ideological motive by terrorist and extremist organizations in different parts of the world. What's more is the fact that the issue is unresolved has resulted in untold suffering on the part of the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, Arab states, and all of the many Palestinian diasporas living therein, including refugees who've been forced to remain in camps for decades and decades. This state of play has been exacerbated over the last few years because Washington has acted alone, separately from our collective efforts, from agreed efforts. It's acted alone, imposing on Israel's Arab neighbors an economic peace without settling the Palestinian issue. We've reached a situation whereby there are now individual unilateral initiatives which not only ignore but actually undermine the international legal basis for the settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict endorsed by the UN and enshrined in UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. The US has attempted to turn a blind eye to the ongoing construction of Israeli settlements on the occupied territory. It's recognized Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights. And what we've now seen is the Americans calling for an end to the settler violence being foisted upon Palestinians in the West Bank. As a result, Palestinians who see no way out. And we see a conflict that's unprecedented in terms of its scope and risks spilling over to the entire Middle East. Over all these years, we've been warning about the fact that this course has no prospects. It's dangerous and can result in tragic consequences. This new outbreak of violence proves what we've said many times before. A normalization of Israel's relations with Arab states, although of course that would be positive, cannot occur at the expense of the Palestinians. It cannot result in a lasting stabilization of the situation unless we resolve a key issue in the Middle East, that is the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This approach, as we saw for ourselves when on the 27th of October, here in this chamber, we adopted the Jordanian resolution. This approach is supported by the leadership of all Arab, Muslim, and many other states. It's a paradox that on the one part, the entire international community has recognized that Israel's activities in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal because they're at odds with UN Security Council resolutions and the provisions of international law. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, our Western colleagues in their statements prefer to simply forget that this unprecedented escalation on the ground is also a consequence of the settlement policy of West Jerusalem, as well as the systematic restrictions West Jerusalem has placed on the Palestinians' ability to freely visit their holy sites. We're delighted that Antonio Guterres did not shy away from flagging this, speaking during Security Council deliberations on the Middle East on the 24th of October. He noted that the current uptick in violence did not happen in a vacuum. As a result, he was immediately subjected to irate and undeserved criticism on the part of Israel, which preferred to see history starting from a blank page, to see history begin on the 7th of October 2023. Colleagues, we'll all have to return to the root causes of the conflict. We'll have to put the Israeli-Palestinian settlement process on an agreed track. However, right now we need to immediately cease fire and put an end to the bloodshed. This should be obvious to all, you'd think. Unfortunately, our Western colleagues at the Security Council are continuing to torpedo any efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground. They continue to block the UN Security Council's attempt to urgently take measures to immediately normalize the situation, first and foremost to enact a ceasefire. This is what common sense dictates. What's more is, it's what humanitarian organizations in Gaza are calling for. Clearly, the fully fledged ground operation Israel has begun in Gaza can turn not just into a tragedy for 2 million Gazans, it can also trigger a regional conflagration. You'd think that everyone understands just how dangerous this scenario is, and yet it's only Washington which won't listen, which hypocritically is trying to pursue its own regional agenda, politicizing UN Security Council draft resolutions, trying to pass them, but we did not allow it to pass, nor did China. Our US colleagues are trying not just to divert attention from the failures of their policy to shift blame when it is itself at fault. They are accusing Iran, Hezbollah, and Gazans of all of the world's ills. They're also trying to legitimize all this, legitimize the ground operation through the Security Council. We remember the no-fly zone in Libya in 2019 when our Western colleagues had no trouble interpreting UN Security Council Resolution 1973 to their own benefit, waging an aggression on Libya. The UN Security Council does not have the right to grant this kind of carte blanche. President, I'd like to highlight that when we condemn the killing of Israeli civilians and foreigners in Israel, when we do that, we still cannot turn a blind eye to what Western Jerusalem is doing. They're committing flagrant violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods are being razed to the ground. According to information, we have over 8.5 thousand people have been killed in the Enclave. Most of them are women, children, and the elderly. Indiscriminate airstrikes have taken over 3,000 lives. Young Gazans are lying there under the rubble. Over 2,000 of them. Half of them are children. As a result of the latest strike on the Jabalya refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, over 400 people died. The number of losses amongst UN personnel is staggering. 64 people have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. The number of IDPs in the Gaza Strip stands at 1.6 million people. As a result of the bombing of the Strip, 9 hospitals are completely out of commission. The rest of the hospitals are facing acute shortages of medicines. Over 100 people, including over 300 people, including many of them children, have also perished in the West Bank. Against this backdrop, Israeli officials are making insulting pronouncements regarding all Palestinians, talking about the collective responsibility of an entire people, responsibility for the actions of Hamas. Israel's orders to evacuate over 1 million people are pronouncements that do not hold water. Also, the total blockade imposed by Israel on the Strip is unacceptable. It's cut off from the rest of the world. This blockade has provoked panic amongst these frightened people who've lost all hope. It's undermined the work of medical and emergency staff and will inevitably result in greater civilian casualties. You cannot vanquish terrorism using these means. We call on the parties to the conflict to immediately put an end to the bloodshed, to give mediators an opportunity to seek a diplomatic solution, including the swift release of hostages. We will have to go down this path sooner or later. The question is how many innocent people will die until the decision is taken to do so. President, colleagues, we cannot but mention the hypocrisy of the US and their allies. They, in other completely different situations, are issuing appeals for the respect of humanitarian law, establishing investigations committees, imposing sanctions on those who are actually genuinely only resorting to force as a last resort to put an end to years of violence. And yet today we're witnessing horrific destruction in Gaza, greater than all the West criticizes in other regions, greater by many orders of magnitude. We're seeing strikes on humanitarian objects, including hospitals, thousands of children dying, horrific suffering on the part of civilians under conditions of a total blockade, and yet the West remains silent. The only thing they can muster is continued pronouncements about Israel's supposed right to self-defense, although as an occupying power, it does not have that power, as confirmed by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice handed down in the year 2004. We hope that these blatant double standards are obvious to our colleagues in the Global South. As for Israel's security, and we recognize its right to ensure its security, this security can only be fully guaranteed if we resolve the Palestinian issue on the basis of relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We do not deny Israel the right to fight terrorism, but fight the terrorists. Don't fight civilians. Otherwise, you yourselves are taking the side of evil. You are deploying the same methods evil deploys. The Jewish people suffered persecution for many centuries, and the Jewish people should know better than anyone that the suffering of ordinary people, innocent lives lost, in the name of blind retribution, will neither restore justice nor bring the dead back to life nor console their families. Islam, Christianity, Judaism are united in recognizing the value of human life, which belongs to God. God giveth, and only God is entitled to take it away. In these very testing times, the Russian Federation is taking active measures to immediately resolve the crisis. We are very much in favor of an ongoing negotiation process at an endorsed UN forum, following which we should establish a sovereign Palestinian state within 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side in peace and security with Israel. On this note, we'd like to commend the efforts of the Arab group, spearheaded by Jordan. They authored the UNGA resolution adopted on the 27th of October. That resolution called for urgent measures to put an end to the violence, to the military hostilities, to immediately release hostages, to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and to disallow the conflict spilling over into the rest of the region. The Russian Federation wholeheartedly supported this Arab peace initiative. In fact, we are one of the co-sponsors. We urge all states to implement it. President, we stand convinced that in addition to resolving this new uptick in violence, we must put paid to this upsurge in violence, but also come up with a strategy of collective action to achieve the political resolution of this conflict. This is something that the Middle Eastern Quartet, which is made up of Russia, the US, the EU, and the UN, was working on, but it has been blocked by Washington. On the agenda, we have a joint mediation mechanism with a key role for regional states, and we've seen positive trends of late in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States, all of this proves that countries in the region, when they take the situation into their hands without being subjected to external pressure, they can progress a great deal towards a stabilization in the Middle East. Under the current circumstances, the Russian Federation is in favor of constructive exchanges with all parties involved. We're ready to continue contributing to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including at this stage, once we neutralize the current crisis. First and foremost, we need to put an end to the violence, unless we want to put away the idea of resolving this conflict one day. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to this distinguished representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Nepal is grieving under deep anguish in the death of 10 Nepali nationals in southern Israel when it came under sudden attack on 7 October 2023. The government of Nepal has strongly condemned the terrorist attack on Israel. With equal gravity, we are against the indiscriminate use of force against civilians by both parties involved in the conflict, including the strike at the hospital in Gaza that killed hundreds of people, including children, women, elderly, medical personnel, and patients. We are deeply disturbed by the rising number of deaths of civilians, destruction of properties, and the resulting humanitarian crisis. Nothing can justify inflicting sufferings on and killings of innocent people, whether Palestinians or Israelis. Nepal calls for an immediate de-escalation and avoidance of indiscriminate use of force to prevent civilian casualties, stop the destruction of public and private properties, and provide immediate, unrestricted, and adequate humanitarian assistance to the desperate civilians in Gaza. The United Nations has the responsibility to prevent humanitarian catastrophe and breach of peace. We, the member states, must demonstrate courage to utilize the platform of the United Nations to bring both sides to the negotiating table to find a just, peaceful, amicable, and lasting political solution to the problem. To this end, Nepal supports the efforts made by the Secretary General to de-escalate war, open humanitarian corridors, and avail unrestricted humanitarian relief. We are deeply concerned about our missing student, Mr. Bipin Joshi, and are desperately waiting for the information on his whereabouts. Nepal is in favor of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security within recognized international borders based on international law and the relevant UN resolutions. This is the only way forward for a just, lasting, and peaceful solution to the question of Israel-Palestine conflict. Peace is only possible when both sides respect each other's existence and dignity. Hatred never incubates peace. Nepal calls upon both sides to exercise maximum restraint and resort to dialogue to find a solution where both Israelis and Palestinians live in peace. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nepal, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, it was the great Mahatma who told us that an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind. Is that what we seek to achieve, distinguished delegates? He didn't stop there. He asked us the question, what difference does it make to the dead, the injured, the orphans, and the homeless, whether the mad destruction is wrought under the name of totalitarianism or the holy name of liberty or democracy? That's the question he asked. Mr. President, liberty and democracy, the Mahatma says, becomes unholy, when our hands are dyed red with innocent blood. In the context of today, that's perhaps very easy to understand. Mr. President, victory attained by violence is tantamount to a defeat, for it is momentary. The weak, they say, can never forgive. Forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Sri Lanka therefore offers these words of gentle persuasion to our fellow beings who are at war, a war that neither will win, but will surely leave a loser, and that is humanity. Is that the legacy, I ask, we desire to leave our future generations? Is this the agenda we intend to prosecute for peace? Do we really believe we can achieve the SDGs in such a hostile environment? Mr. President, it was only in the latter half of last September, that our leaders met in this august assembly, in this very hall, to lay the foundation for a better world. We deliberated upon what remedial measures should be taken, as the euphemism suggested, to get back into the game that did not look promising at halftime. We comforted ourselves in the thought that many games are won in the second half. Dreams, isn't it? It was only on that optimistic note that we resolved to take upon the challenge of working towards those lofty goals. We discussed the vital role of financing for development. We discussed the climate catastrophe confronting the planet. We adopted 3 declarations on the main topics on health concerning our countries. Our ministers adopted the scope and elements of what would be the summit of the future. However, the supreme irony is that in contrast, we are compelled to witness death and destruction. violent attacks on civilians, kidnappings, and hostage-taking, and retaliatory measures on civilian life and property, and the threat of a wider conflict. Mr. President, all this predictably will ensure the game will be lost at full time if the hostilities and military misadventures we witness in Palestine and Israel today does not stop now. As the PGA was pleased to observe in his opening statement of this emergency special session, the war drums must stop beating. Mr. President, Sri Lanka is therefore deeply concerned by the ongoing escalation of violence and military action in Gaza, which is causing deaths and injuries to many innocent civilians and children, resulting in a grave humanitarian situation. The legitimate security concerns of both Israeli and Palestinian people have to be recognized. We observe that indiscriminate actions that cause civilian casualties will only make the realization of an enduring peace a distant reality. Sri Lanka supports diplomatic efforts to find a lasting solution to the conflict and humbly requests both parties to engage in a dialogue to achieve a durable peace. Mr. President, since the adoption of the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations last Friday by this Assembly, the situation in Gaza has worsened manifold. Death and destruction continue unabated. According to UNRWA, over 1 million people have been displaced. The UNICEF has reported that out of the total dead, 3,450 are children, innocent children. The United Nations last Sunday held a memorial for 59 UNRWA staff killed in Gaza. Millions are suffering without basic essentials and face a lifetime of trauma. I'm asking the question, will such trauma solve the problems of the Middle East? So we reiterate our call to keep open a humanitarian corridor to provide urgent humanitarian assistance to the civilians in Gaza, and are committed to supporting the efforts and activities of the United Nations Secretary General in his endeavor to mitigate the suffering of the people, the loss and damage to life and property, and to bring about a ceasefire. Mr. President, Sri Lanka calls for the free movement of essential items and humanitarian aid, including food, fuel, medicine, and electricity and water supply to Gaza. We call on all sides to immediately halt violence and take steps to prevent further civilian casualties. We also call upon the international community to redouble their efforts and support the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The UNRWA is playing a commendable and courageous role, I must say, in helping a vulnerable population under extremely challenging circumstances. Mr. President, in the light of the ongoing hostilities, it is therefore important, my delegation says, to address the situation with empathy, with understanding, and a commitment to finding a peaceful resolution. We therefore have a plea to the leaders and the peoples of Israel and Palestine. We acknowledge, of course, the deep pain, the loss, suffering that both sides have experienced as a result of the ongoing hostilities. We urge you to prioritize the well-being and security of all individuals involved and to work towards a lasting peace that ensures the safety, dignity, and the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. We understand that finding a solution to such a complex and long-standing conflict is not easy. However, we strongly encourage meaningful dialogue and negotiations with the aim of reaching a comprehensive and just agreement that addresses the core issues which are at hand, which includes addressing concerns related to borders, settlements, security, Jerusalem, and the right to self-determination. Mr. President, we believe that it is crucial to recognize and respect the aspirations of the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. Mutual understanding, empathy, and compromise will surely build the essential trust in creating a conducive environment for peaceful coexistence. We therefore urge you to listen to one another's concerns and perspectives, and to engage in constructive dialogue that promotes understanding and reconciliation. We also call upon the international community to play an active role in these efforts. Mr. President, ending hostilities and achieving a just and lasting peace will require courage, will require leadership, and a genuine commitment to finding common ground. However bleak the prospects may be, we believe that with dedication, goodwill, and a shared vision for a better future, it is possible to achieve a peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. Let us therefore foster social cohesion, make available lifelong learning opportunities, promote reconciliation and healing, rebuild infrastructure, promote economic recovery, strengthen institutions and governance, engage civil society, and promote participation, and finally, invest in peace building and conflict prevention at the community and national levels. Mr. President, it is our prayer and hope that together we can build a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity by committing our resources and our cooperation from all our governments, international organizations, and the whole of our global community. Let us therefore seize upon, I say, this opportunity to break the cycle of violence and work towards a future that upholds the values of justice, equality, and the respect for human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Mr. President, I align myself with the statement delivered previously by the EU and would like to add the following in my national capacity. Let me start by recognizing the courageous work and sacrifice of UN employees in Gaza, and in particular those, including the 70 UNRWA staff, who had paid the ultimate price in the line of duty. I would also like to extend our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Mr. President, the gravity of the situation in the Middle East gives us great concern. This serious crisis presents a huge challenge and a test to all of us. In view of the above, Greece welcomes the attempts of the Security Council to address the situation in Israel and Gaza and regrets that these efforts so far have not been fruitful. We acknowledge that discussions are still ongoing and we hope that a conclusion will be reached. My country, right from the start, condemned in the strongest possible terms Hamas for its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. Terrorism has no justification. Any form of violence, terrorism, or inhumane treatment is totally unacceptable. Israel has a right to its self-defense, to react and protect its citizens, always in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We call for the immediate release of all hostages without any precondition. Human lives cannot be reduced to a bargaining chip. At the same time, we are particularly alarmed by the catastrophic humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. All civilians must be protected at all times by all parties. To protect civilians and provide life-saving supplies, all necessary measures should be taken, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. Our aim should be to protect as many lives as possible. In this regard, we are stepping up our assistance together with our partners to help those in need. Yet, we should all make sure that this conflict will not spill over and take far-reaching dimensions in the Middle East. We call on all states and international organizations to intensify urgent concrete steps to support efforts by the United Nations and regional states to prevent the violence in Gaza from expanding to other areas in the region. Greece's foreign policy is a principled one. We remain fully committed to a two-state solution in accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolution. Only a political solution could create the long-term condition for peace, stability, and prosperity in the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Greece, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius.
Mr. President, it is now 6 days since the UNGA, acting under the Uniting for Peace initiative, adopted a resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Yet, the bombs are still exploding and civilians are still dying in huge numbers. Even before the resolution was adopted, Mauritius fully supported the Secretary General's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Bloodshed of innocent civilians and destruction of basic infrastructure are unacceptable and will continue to fuel further violence. As we speak, the situation is worsening on the ground with no sign of abatement. We call on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint. According to latest reports, more than 10,000 civilians have fallen victims to the hostilities, whilst above 25,000 are suffering from injuries. 1.65 million people have been displaced already. It is revolting to note that women and children account for more than 62% of the fatalities. Moreover, 67 UN staff members working with the Palestinian Refugee Agency have been killed during airstrikes, with around 44 UNRWA installations being damaged. Yet again, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in front of our very eyes. In the Gaza Strip, people have limited or no access to basic necessities, while food, drinking water, health services, safe shelter, and electricity are no longer existent. Latest reports indicate that the Gaza Strip is hardly able to sustain essential services. The international community needs to act now. Violence in Palestine must cease. The world cannot take the risk that violence spreads to other parts of Palestine and the neighboring countries. We welcome the safe passage of some aid convoys into the Gaza Strip for the supply of basic food, basic goods, essential medical equipment, and fuel so that health facilities can continue to operate. And we hope that adequate supply continues to flow in order to save as many lives as possible. Mauritius expresses its profound sympathies to the families of the victims as a result of the conflict both in Israel and the Gaza Strip. Mauritius strongly condemns violence in all its forms, including the terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, resulting in a number of hostages being taken. We welcome initiatives to find immediate solutions on various aspects of the conflict. The recent release of some hostages demonstrates that dialogue is only possible and is in fact the only way to find solution to the current situation. We appeal for the immediate release without conditions of all innocent civilians being held captive. Mauritius takes this opportunity to commend the efforts of all parties engaged in facilitating such release. Mr. President, Mauritius reiterates its unwavering support for a two-state solution based on relevant UN resolutions and on international law, which envisages the establishment of an independent, viable, and prosperous Palestinian state within secure and recognized borders, living in peace side by side with the State of Israel. We make a strong plea to both parties to urgently come to the negotiating table to revive peace talks in good faith. It is only through such talks that a peaceful and long-lasting solution can be found. Mauritius supports the holding of a series of international conferences under the auspices of the United Nations, involving all major actors, including Israel and Palestine, to agree to an immediate ceasefire and reopen the discussions with a view to finding a lasting solution. In this respect, we continue to encourage the Secretary General in his mediation efforts. At the same time, the full weight and scope of international humanitarian law must apply. Violence and terror only bring destruction and untold suffering. It is high time that a comprehensive solution is found to the conflict based on the principles of the United Nations Charter and on international law. Mr. President, we must all strive together to give peace a chance at a time when the world is already beset by a cascade of interlinked global crises. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mauritius, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lesotho.
Mr. President, I take the floor. As I take the floor, allow me to join others in conveying our deepest condolences and words of sympathies to all families who have lost their loved ones in both Israel and Palestine as a result of this unprecedented conflict of our times. We also pay tribute to the United Nations humanitarian personnel who died in the line of duty while working selflessly to provide hope and support to the desperate civilians in Gaza. Our thoughts and prayers are with the injured. We continue to offer our solidarity to those who are working tirelessly in their mediation efforts in order to find lasting peace and stability in that region of the world, with the main objective of averting further loss of life of innocent civilians. It would be remiss of me not to commend the General Assembly for taking a principled and historical step last Friday by prioritizing the humanitarian situation of the people of Palestine through the adoption of the resolution that recognizes the centrality of preservation of lives of innocent civilians. However, my delegation remains mindful of the fact that adoption of the said resolution does not in any way whatsoever symbolize the end of the conflict in question. It only calls for further engagement by all and sundry to do our utmost to find a lasting diplomatic and political solution to this problem, which has acquired unprecedented proportions of our lifetime. Regrettably, the repeated failure of the UN Security Council to pass a definitive resolution on this conflict erodes confidence of the global citizenry on the functionality of this organization, thus amplifying the clarion call for its reform. We implore its members to take full responsibility and find an immediate solution to this war. Mr. President, my delegation is deeply concerned about the violation of human rights of people on both sides, some of which have been abducted, while others are being cut off from the essential basic needs. Unfortunately, most of them are women and children who are non-combatants. In this regard, we call for the immediate release of those kept in captivity. The world cannot continue to watch the horrifying pictures of children in Gaza being mercilessly killed on a daily basis from the Israeli bombardment. Under these circumstances, Lesotho appeals to all parties involved to exercise maximum restraint. Mr. President, further escalation of this conflict raises legitimate concerns regarding its potentiality to spiral out of proportion. We are therefore all bound to call on the parties involved to give way to a diplomatic solution without any further delay. At the same time, we urge all parties to allow humanitarian corridors with guarantees of safety to humanitarian personnel. In conclusion, Chair, we express concern over any attempt to forcibly relocate the people of Gaza, contrary to the past UN resolutions, in which unequivocally recognize their inalienable right to self-determination. Our wish is that of a two-state solution wherein both Israelis and Palestinians will live side by side in peace with each other, in line with the pre-adopted UN resolutions. History has proved beyond reasonable doubt that the cost of war is insurmountable in all its facets. As a result, during this critical time, the world must stand up steadfastly to recall the very foundations of the United Nations and live up to them. Finally, Chair, as John Donne puts it in his poem, no man is an island entire of itself. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lesotho. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
Honorable Chair, at the outset, I would like to extend my thanks to you for resuming the 10th Emergency Special Session of the UN General Assembly to the backdrop of the painful and unfortunate developments that the Gaza Strip is witnessing and its dire humanitarian implications. Honorable Chair, the adoption by the General Assembly last week of a resolution that calls for an immediate and permanent and sustainable humanitarian pause that leads to a cessation of hostilities with a majority of 121 countries is a reflection of the world's demands for immediate measures to end the war. It is now time to respond to these calls and work tirelessly in order to achieve a permanent ceasefire in a manner that guarantees the safety and security of all parties. The Security Council has so far been unable to issue a resolution that puts an end to the consistent escalation that is causing untold suffering for the fraternal Palestinian people. Nevertheless, the Kingdom of Bahrain is calling upon the international community to uphold its humanitarian responsibilities in responding to the GA's resolution and to move immediately to preserve the lives and properties of people and the safety and security and stability of the region. We must also work to implement the legitimate international resolutions concerned with the Palestinian question and support the National Palestinian Authorities and the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the only legitimate representative of the fraternal Palestinian people. And under these cruel circumstances, the number one priority should be the protection of civilians on both sides of the conflict, and the international community should not hesitate to condemn any action that could lead to the loss of innocent lives, especially the murder of children and women. Such scenes of death and destruction can create entire generations filled with accumulated anger and thirst for vengeance, without solutions for any of our key causes. The Kingdom of Bahrain re-emphasizes the importance of consistent diplomatic efforts among all regional and international parties to de-escalate through an immediate ceasefire and an end to military operations, along with providing protection to innocent civilians on both the Palestinian and Israeli sides, and the release of all hostages and captives and detainees, in addition to refraining from any practices that could widen the circle of violence. We also emphasize the importance of lifting the siege off of the Gaza Strip and opening humanitarian passages and corridors and facilitating the flows of medical assistance and food and water and fuel and electricity unimpeded to the Gaza Strip. We must also put an end to the targeting of residential neighborhoods and health, educational, and social facilities and houses of worship and infrastructure. And we must reject any attempts for forcibly displacing Palestinians from their lands in line with the international humanitarian law and the Fourth Geneva Convention for the year 1949. We value political and diplomatic efforts made on all levels in order to put an end to this destructive war. Therefore, we value the call made by His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, for an immediate ceasefire for humanitarian purposes. We value all his sincere endeavors to advance the role of the UN and to uphold its responsibilities and serve humanity. The Kingdom of Bahrain, led by His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, King of the Kingdom of Bahrain, may Allah keep and protect him, and along with the directives of the government led by His Highness Crown Prince Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, may Allah protect him, reasserts that the two-state solution is the only true guarantee for peaceful coexistence between the Palestinian and the Israeli people. There will be no stability in the Middle East without guaranteeing the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, especially a just, lasting, and sustainable peace in the region. We restate our steadfast position in support of the legitimate rights of the fraternal Palestinian people, chief among which is the right to establish their independent sovereign state with the borders of the 4th of June 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, as per the two-state solution and in line with the international law and the Arab Peace Initiative and the relevant resolutions issued by the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. In conclusion, Mr. President, continued escalation in the Gaza Strip will lead the region to a dangerous abyss and a new cycle of violence. The victims will be civilians and innocents. There will be more suffering and violations. Therefore, we need concerted efforts in order to contain this crisis and its catastrophic humanitarian implications, and we must work to establish a just, permanent, and lasting peace by including more peaceful negotiations and dialogue as per the rules of the international law for the peace and security and stability of all regions' peoples. Thank you.
Of Bahrain. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I begin by expressing the deepest condolences of my country to all the victims of this resurgence of the conflict of long date. My country joins in those voices that have expressed deep-seated concern for the escalation of the violation and the grave unraveling of the situation in Israel, the Gaza Strip, the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, and the region. Without reservation, we condemn all acts of terrorism, regardless of the motivation and regardless of where it takes place, by whom, and when it is committed. We ask that these indiscriminate attacks stop and that all aggressions perpetrated against the civilian population cease. We also express our deep-seated concern for the disastrous humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the repercussions for the civilian population. We recall with heavy hearts that boys and girls are half of the population in Gaza, and they have lived their entire lives in a zone under constant conflict and siege. We express our support to the efforts of the Secretary General and for all of his calls in favor of immediate access and without impediments for humanitarian assistance to respond to the needs of the Palestinian civilian people in Gaza. However, we call for concrete measures to be taken to contribute effectively to a cessation of violence in the region and to put a stop to the suffering of the civilian population who are the most affected in this situation. We recognize the leadership efforts and fundamental role played by the group of Arab states to bring about a cessation of hostilities, to guarantee the protection of the civilian population, and to provide humanitarian assistance. Once again, we welcome the adoption of the resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Fulfillment of Legal and Humanitarian Obligations of Friday, 27 October. We believe that it was a concrete and tangible result yielded by this special emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly. Notwithstanding that, Mr. President, despite the adoption of the resolution at the same time that we met to resume the session, thousands of innocent people, including boys and girls, are losing their lives in Gaza, and many more are also losing their hopes that the violence stop, that the conflict come to an end, and that this organization take measures that would have an impact and put an end to their suffering. The meeting was convened after 6 days having elapsed, during which hundreds of people died in a horrific manner in the attack on the Al-Ali Arab hospital, many of whom were seeking refuge from the constant bombing in Gaza. Today, to date, more than 9,700 people have died, more than 21,000 have been wounded, and more than 1.4 million people have been displaced. These tragic numbers and events have done nothing more than increase with every hour that goes by, exacerbated by the events of recent days around the world. People have been following the development of this conflict with incredulity, frustration, and anguish. Many ask themselves, where is the United Nations? Where are the bodies that were created to protect the rights of thousands of people, especially those groups that are the most vulnerable? The people of the world are looking at this organization that was created to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and we must not fail them anymore. Rather than adopt resolutions that are legally binding with concrete mandates to put a stop to the fire, the Security Council has seen itself wrapped up in a vicious cycle of the presentation of resolutions and meetings and vetoes that do nothing more than undermine the little credibility that this body enjoyed before the resurgence of the conflict. Nothing, and I repeat, nothing, justifies the inaction of the United Nations given the human suffering that we have witnessed in recent weeks. My country strenuously calls on the members of the Security Council, especially those who abuse their veto power, to fulfill their responsibilities, and that all members of the General Assembly have commended them under the United Nations Charter to maintain international peace and security. We urge that a stop be put to thinking under the shadow of individual particular interests, and that action be taken in keeping with the well-being of all humanity. This assembly has played its role, and its message was clear. The majority of states represented in this organization condemn all acts of violence aimed at Palestinian and Israeli civilians and ask for an immediate humanitarian truce, which is lasting and sustained, and that would lead to a cessation of hostilities. The Security Council then needs to listen to this call and take immediate action. Mr. President, my country is asking for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. No atrocity can justify another atrocity. We deplore and repudiate all attacks and aggressions against civilians and destruction that is widespread. We vigorously condemn the violence inflicted upon the civilian people, regardless of whom it's committed by and where. We ask for the immediate release of all civilians and demand their security, well-being, and humane treatment in keeping with international law. We have heard, we have recognized and made our own the clamor of the families that are asking for their loved ones to be able to go home. We ask all parties to immediately and fully comply with all the obligations incumbent upon them under international law, including international humanitarian law and the international law of human rights. Civilians, humanitarian personnel, and civilian humanitarian goods need to be unconditionally protected and at all times. We would underscore the impact and grave repercussions of armed conflicts, especially on women, boys and girls, and all civilians who are existing in a condition of vulnerability, such as people with disabilities or senior citizens. As put by the executive director of UNICEF just a couple of days ago, the real cost of the most recent escalation will be measured in the lives of girls and boys. Those losses due to the violence and those lives forever changed by the violence. We also ask that in fulfillment of international humanitarian law, all humanitarian and civilian facilities be respected and protected, including hospitals, medical facilities, transportation and equipment for medical care, schools, and places of religious faith and facilities of the United Nations. We unequivocally condemn all the aggressions and all attacks against the United Nations staff, humanitarian and personnel workers, and doctors, other medical staff, journalists, and the media. And we firmly defend their respect and protection. May I now take a moment to express our most sincere condolences and deep condolences to the families and members of UNRWA for the Palestinian refugees and all the humanitarian organizations that have suffered losses in this conflict. We pay tribute and we honor the memory of all the women and men who have lost their lives, protecting the rights and the dignity of the civilian population in the region. May I also express our deep admiration of UNRWA, which, despite the fact that is in a situation of chronic underfunding, it has spared no efforts to save the lives and safeguard the lives of the civilians in Gaza. We ask that the financial gap of the body be urgently addressed to provide humanitarian assistance, maintain basic services, and pay UNRWA staff. Mr. President, humanitarian access must immediately, fully, sustain, and safely be facilitated without any restrictions so that essential services and supplies can reach all the civilians in the Gaza Strip. This should not be limited just to water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity. We would underscore the imperative need under international humanitarian law to guarantee that the civilians not be deprived of what they need for their survival. We ask that to that end, immediately and effectively, humanitarian corridors be established with full protection and other initiatives be taken to facilitate the delivery of assistance to civilians. Mr. President, my country firmly rejects any forced attempt to move the civilian Palestinian population. And in this regard, we request a cancellation of the order that Palestinians, UN staff, humanitarian workers, or medical staff evacuate the zone north of the Gaza Strip. We reiterate that measures must be adopted that are adequate to guarantee the safety and well-being of civilians and their protection, especially girls and boys, and allow for their displacement in conditions of security. Mr. President, El Salvador joins the call of all parties to all parties that they act with a maximum amount of moderation. Today, that's more important than ever in order to prevent a further destabilization of the region and further escalation of violence in the region. We all have a responsibility in this regard. We ask the parties, especially those that have influence on the parties, to work urgently to that end. We highlight the need to guarantee accountability for the uncountable number of victims in this conflict. Investigations need to be undertaken that are independent and transparent under international norms and in keeping with them. It is necessary to put an end to impunity, guarantee justice, and prevent further violations. Mr. President, we recall here that a lasting solution to this conflict can only be achieved through peaceful means and with the will of the parties, based on each and every resolution of the Security Council and of this General Assembly. We recall that the United Nations, under the resolutions adopted by this General Assembly, have an ongoing responsibility with regard to the Palestinian question until it is settled in all aspects. We recall that achieving a lasting, fair, and general settlement of this question is indispensable in order to bring about peace and stability in the Middle East. We urge the international community to redouble its efforts and coordinate efforts geared to restoring the political horizon and to promoting and expediting a fair, lasting, and peaceful solution to the conflict. What is required with urgency is a collective effort to begin talks on the peace process in the Middle East. Mr. President, El Salvador wishes for this special session of the General Assembly to be the beginning of a process that would lead to the so desired peace in the region. It is in our hands to return hope to people, the hope that they placed in this organization. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of El Salvador, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Panama.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Panama reiterates its vigorous condemnation of the terrorist attacks and the violence perpetrated by Hamas against Israeli civilians last October. According to international humanitarian law and conventions and the treaties of international law, deeply committed to the protection of and respect of human life, Panama emphatically regrets the resurgence of violence that has led to the loss of lives of thousands of people in a series of violent events that have convulsed the region, such as the attack on the hospital in the north of Gaza, and which, moreover, led to the destruction of both civilian and humanitarian infrastructure that need to be protected by international law and by international humanitarian law by all parties. Given the grave situation in the Middle East, Panama calls for peace and the respect of human rights, with special attention for people who are most vulnerable in the Gaza Strip, life, health, and the well-being of the entire population, with emphasis on women, children, boys and girls, and teenagers, senior citizens, and persons with disabilities needs to be respected and protected. We also urge all parties involved to exercise restraint and to strictly respect the norms under international humanitarian law, both customary and by convention. This is essential to protect civilians and medical facilities in the areas of armed conflict. The escalation of violence only further deepens us into human suffering, increases the loss of lives without religious origin or ethnic distinction. Therefore, We also defend the idea of a humanitarian corridor that would allow the delivery without impediment in a continuous and safe manner of medical and humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza. It's viable, it's possible, and it's urgent to do so. We also call for the urgent release without conditions of all of the civilians who have been abducted. In that regard, we recognize the efforts of the international actors who are dedicated to this task. The international community cannot tolerate the use of civilian hostages as a form of blackmail. Panama reaffirms its unbreakable commitment to peace, security, and stability in the Middle East and in the world. We should be an international community that demands the construction of a lasting peace, and we reiterate our firm commitment to multilateralism with the aspiration that it bring about an immediate cessation of violence and that international law be respected and that an effective path to peaceful settlement of the conflict be opened. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Panama, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Mr. President, we are faced with a very serious crisis in the Middle East, and it is paramount to address the unfolding humanitarian situation, to save lives, and to facilitate solutions to avoid regional escalation. At the 10th General Assembly Emergency Special Session, we meet to defend the principles and norms of the UN Charter and to reaffirm that there is no justification for terrorism anywhere and anytime, nor for loss of lives of any kind. Romania condemns in the strongest possible terms the indiscriminate and atrocious terrorist attacks committed by Hamas across Israel, starting with October 7th, 2023. Each country has the right to defend itself and its citizens against terrorism, Israel included, in line with international law. We are profoundly shocked by the large amount of lost lives of Israeli and Palestinian alike, and our thoughts are with all the innocent victims of the conflict. Romania is one of the countries that mourns the loss of 5 dual nationals. All hostages held by Hamas must be immediately released. We acknowledge the work undertaken by international partners in releasing them. As one of the countries that has dual nationals held hostage, we hope the work in releasing them will continue. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. On the contrary, it acts against their aspirations by harming the Palestinian cause and the prospects of the two-state solution. My delegation reiterates the call to make a clear distinction between the justified and legitimate Palestinian expectations and demarches, which should be only addressed as part of a political process, and the terrorist attacks of Hamas, which are harming, in the end, Palestinian lives and the Palestinian future. Mr. President, at this stage of the conflict, it is important to reaffirm the respect of international law and the universal principles of international humanitarian law, particularly the Geneva Conventions. The protection of civilians, especially children, must be ensured at all times by all. While we welcome the humanitarian trucks that crossed Rafah last weekend and in the following days, we should be firm and united in upholding unhindered humanitarian assistance to Gaza. These measures are necessary, including humanitarian pauses, so as to allow the full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access consistent with international humanitarian law for United Nations humanitarian agencies and their implementing partners to act swiftly. All civilians should be protected at all times. As you know, the European Union and its member states will continue their efforts to assist EU citizens in the region. From a national point of view, this also includes their evacuation upon request. The conflict in Gaza not only destroys the future of Israelis and Palestinians, but it has also an immense potential to sparkle hate speech around the world. The rise of anti-Semitism, of anti-Palestinian or Islamophobic speech in the world is of great concern. It is the moment to act again and speak out against hatred. We are convinced that the most durable solutions to such complex situation are only those emerging and endorsed by all the legitimate parties involved. And therefore, Romania has abstained at the vote on the draft resolution. Mr. President, for too long, there is a lack of meaningful progress of the Middle East peace process. Many windows of opportunity have been lost, and in the end, civilians pay the price. However, we cannot give up peace. The two-state solution remains indispensable and the only option available for a lasting resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The two-state solution remains also indispensable for bringing just and lasting peace in the Middle East based on international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The two-state solution will prevent the spillover of the conflict and stop other actors in fueling it. My delegation stands ready to engage for mediation efforts as part of the joint international responsibility to maintain peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Romania, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Barbados.
Mr. President, Barbados associates itself with the statement delivered by Jamaica on behalf of the Caribbean community during this session, as well as with the CARICOM statement of 9 October 2023. Barbados condemns the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated on Israel on October 7, 2023, which caused over 1,000 to lose their lives and hundreds to be taken hostage, including women and children. Those responsible for these devastating violent acts must be brought to account. We express our alarm at the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and our deep concern for the safety and security of the people of Israel and Palestine. The conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza threatens to spill over to the entire Middle East, with catastrophic results for the people of that region, for global peace, and for the already fragile multilateral order. If this conflict continues unabated, it will also have devastating impacts on vulnerable populations everywhere. The international community of states and their peoples must therefore unite and prevent the situation from any further deterioration. The UN Security Council must act urgently and in unison. In this regard, Barbados welcomes the adoption on Friday, 27 October, by our Assembly of a resolution which called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This was an important signal by the global community. Barbados voted in favor of that resolution because of its clear call for the protection of all civilians and the release of hostages, for the respect of international law, and for the need to find a lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of a two-state solution. Barbados also supported Canada's proposed amendment because it clearly identified those responsible for the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October on Israel. These points are all in accordance with Barbados's views on the situation as set out in our statement of 24 October. Mr. President, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, as called for by many and by the UN Secretary General, is now essential in order to ensure the protection of the lives and well-being of the innocent civilians of Israel and Gaza. Any aerial bombardment in Gaza, an area smaller than my own country, but with 7 times our population, is bound to have devastating effects on civilians. The death of thousands of Palestinians in these last weeks bears grim testimony to this. Barbados further calls for the immediate unconditional release of all hostages and the provision of humanitarian assistance in all its dimensions to the people of Gaza. I also wish to express Barbados's support and appreciation for the remarkable work and terrible sacrifices of the UN staff on the ground. We commend the Secretary General and his teams for their effort to provide relief and to find a path to peace. Since joining the United Nations upon our independence in 1966, Barbados has always supported a two-state solution, recognizing the rights of the people of both Israel and Palestine to their own state. The international community must now urgently agree and take action to ensure that the Palestinian people can exercise their right to self-determination in an independent, internationally recognized state in accordance with international law. A sustainable peace must be the world's singular focus, and it is only with dialogue that this can be achieved. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Barbados, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Federated States of Micronesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. This emergency special session of the General Assembly meets at a time of extremely difficult circumstances for civilians in both Israel and in Gaza. This august body, every one of us, must do its utmost to address and prevent this crisis, an already volatile situation, from spreading. Mr. President, now more than ever, it is important for this General Assembly to stand against the terror of Hamas and condemn unequivocally the abhorrent and despicable acts of October 7th against civilians and the State of Israel. Many of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. The heinous and brutal acts by Hamas and any other terrorist groups deserves this Assembly's condemnation and should never be tolerated. Terrorist attacks anywhere on anyone should not be condoned and are not justifiable. Neither is it justifiable for terrorists to use schools, hospitals, and innocent Palestinians as human shields. Micronesia stands with any state to defend itself from terrorist acts, and we support Israel's right to defend its territory and its people. It is not only a right under the Charter, the UN Charter, it is the obligation of any sovereign country. Mr. President, on behalf of my country, I express our heartfelt condolences to the families who lost loved ones. We call for the immediate unconditional release of the hostages held by Hamas and want both sides to respect international humanitarian law. We are grateful to those countries that are working tirelessly to save and protect civilian lives, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Any civilian's life lost is a tragedy. Mr. President, peace and security of the entire Middle East are under threat, and the risk of the crisis expanding within and beyond the region is very real. The international community and the United Nations must redouble efforts to bring back the peace process, a durable solution with two people, Israelis and Palestinians, two democratic states living side by side in peace, security, and dignity within mutually recognized borders is necessary for a lasting peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Federated States of Micronesia. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea.
Mr. President, thank you for your stewardship of this emergency special session. Papua New Guinea is seriously concerned about the unfolding situation in Israel and Palestine following the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israel on 7 October 2023. We offer our sincere condolences and sympathies to all victims of the conflict, both in Israel and Palestine, and to those UN staff who have tragically lost their lives in the line of selfless duty. Mr. President, my delegation condemns in the strongest possible terms the barbaric, depraved, and murderous Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist attack on Israel, and particularly against innocent civilians of Israel and other countries. Such heinous act must never be condoned by anyone. This is why we also supported the Canadian draft amendment on Resolution A/ES 10/L.26, which in our view is important. The kidnapping and taking of hostages of Israeli and other countries' citizens, predominantly civilians, including children, the elderly, and women, by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, is also condemned in the strongest possible terms by my delegation. This is against international humanitarian law, and we call for the perpetrators to be held accountable. Papua New Guinea also joins other countries in calling for the urgent release of all hostages held by Hamas and without any preconditions. We welcome the release of those who have been released thus far and urge for the rest held against their will to be freed from abduction and captivity. All lives matter, and all measures are needed to protect civilians and their assets by the conflicting parties. We call on Hamas to not use civilians as human shield. Mr. President, acts of such heinous nature perpetrated by Hamas and such other groups, including Hezbollah, must be designated by the Security Council as terrorist groups that deserve to be dealt with in a similar manner as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Mr. President, Papua New Guinea stands in solidarity with the State of Israel and unequivocally recognizes Israel's right to self-defense under international law. In the exercise of the right to self-defense, we also recognize the importance of proportionality and distinction as provided for under international humanitarian law. Papua New Guinea also strongly supports Israel's rightful existence as a nation and strongly condemns parties, including terrorists and terrorist organizations who are opposed to Israel's statehood. Mr. President, the evolving situation in Israel and Palestine has potential serious implications for peace and security and imperials, lives and livelihoods, not only for the parties to the conflict, but also for the wider Middle East region and beyond. The international community must work with all concerned parties in good faith and mutual respect to urgently de-escalate the situation and restore peace and security in the affected areas. We therefore join others in urging for an urgent humanitarian truce. This must also include the avoidance of the use of inflammatory rhetoric that is unhelpful to de-escalating the tense situation. In this spirit, we appreciate various international and regional efforts underway to de-escalate the situation between Israel and Palestine. Such efforts deserve the international community's support. We also appreciate the humanitarian efforts to provide for the needs of those who are affected by this conflict and extend to the frontline humanitarian workers our gratitude for their selfless service. We also call for the protection of all humanitarian workers and for the parties in the conflict to ensure their safety and security. Mr. President, This current conflict once again brings to the fore the critical importance and urgency for restarting efforts for the two-state solution. We encourage direct negotiations through peaceful means between all stakeholders in Israel and Palestine towards finding a mutually amicable and lasting political solution for Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peaceful coexistence. Finally, Mr. President, we are also concerned with the paralysis in the Security Council to appropriately consider all relevant issues in good faith and to urgently address the worsening situation as seen in the recent series of failed draft Security Council resolutions on this serious, increasing concern for peace and security and the well-being of all parties to the conflict. The Council must do better in the courage of its mandate, a mandate that is representative of all humanity, not just merely representing that of a Council member's parochial interests alone. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Papua New Guinea, and I give the floor now to the distinguished representative of Tonga.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Kingdom of Tonga. Tonga condemns the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas against the State of Israel on the 7th of October 2023, which resulted in the slaughter of civilians. Tonga condemns further the kidnapping of civilians during that attack and who continue to be held captive as hostages. Tonga stands in solidarity with those who call for their immediate and unconditional release. Tonga supports Israel's inherent right of self-defense, as assured by the Charter of the United Nations, in its determined response to protect its citizens and bring stability to the volatile security situation. Mr. President, we acknowledge that this should not lessen the rights of Israelis and Palestinians to live in safety, in dignity, and in peace. Civilians, be they Israelis or Palestinians, are not a target and must be protected. Tonga supports further the desperate need for humanitarian aid to be delivered without restrictions or undue delay. In that regard, any respite in the military campaign in Gaza will be most helpful in order to facilitate delivery of such humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. Mr. President, as we continue our prayers for those who mourn the loss of loved ones, those who have survived, and those who are living now in uncertain fear and pain, the Kingdom of Tonga remains steadfast in its call for a peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tonga, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of San Marino.
Mr. President, Excellencies, San Marino joins the statement previously made by the European Union, and now I would like to make some remarks in my national capacity. The current crisis in the Middle East has brought profound suffering, pain and destruction on both Israeli and Palestinian sides. This crisis demands a prompt and strong response by the international community. Our thoughts today are with all the innocent victims, Israelis, Palestinians, citizens from many other countries, as well as staff members of the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations. San Marino condemns the horrendous terror attacks launched by Hamas on 7 October 2023, the killing of innocent civilians, the holding of hostages, and the continued indiscriminate missile attacks on Israel. The perpetrators of these crime atrocities must be brought to justice. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages without preconditions. In this regard, we welcome all mediation actions carried out by various actors on the international scene, with the aim of enabling the immediate release of people kidnapped in Israel. San Marino recognized the right of Israel to defend itself in line with international law and at the same time recognized the right of the Palestinian people to a free and independent state in accordance with UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. International humanitarian law must be respected at all times. The Palestinian population cannot be blamed for Hamas terrorist acts. The scale of the military operation and the forcible transfer of civilians within the territory, as well as the demolition in the West Bank, are a violation of international humanitarian law. It is essential to ensure at all times the protection of civilians and civilians' infrastructures, in particular medical facilities, schools, and UN premises, as well as to provide urgent humanitarian aid to promptly reach the Palestinian population who are stranded in the Gaza Strip in desperate conditions. Mr. President, it is crucial to avoid regional escalation, and we call on regional actors to refrain from any action that can further aggravate the situation. San Marino supports any initiative that may foster dialogue, promote an immediate ceasefire, and ultimately put an end to the ongoing conflict. We fully respect the right of the State of Israel and the legitimate aspiration and rights of the Palestinian people, and we remain committed to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution. Finally, Mr. President, with reference to the resolution previously adopted, we regret that the amendment proposed by Canada was not adopted. In our point of view, it would have helped the resolution, making it more representative for many countries and finally more inclusive with respect of the position expressed in this venerable assembly. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of San Marino, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, the resumption of the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly on illegal Israeli actions in occupied East Jerusalem and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory comes at a very challenging time and under painful humanitarian circumstances. This debate is of great importance due to its implications for peace and security in the Middle East, a region of great political and diplomatic sensitivity, and which at this moment represents yet another test for multilateralism as mechanism to resolving the intricate international challenges we face today. Angola is deeply concerned about the exponential increase of violence in the Middle East since the 7 October attack, which every day worsens human suffering and takes the lives of innocent civilians, including women and children. We condemn terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, regardless of their motivations or actors. Likewise, we are also alarmed by the likelihood of the Gaza crisis spilling over and turning into a regional conflict with dangerous implications for international peace and stability. The international community must mitigate such risks by urging all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. The only viable way to achieve durable peace is through dialogue and peaceful settlement of disputes. In this context, we support the UN General Assembly resolution that, among other key messages, calls for an immediate, durable, and sustainable humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities and the immediate and unconditional release of all civilian hostages, as well as demands the immediate continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians through the Gaza Strip under the international humanitarian law, and reaffirms that a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be achieved by peaceful means, based on the relevant United Nations resolutions and in accordance with international law and on the basis of the two-state solution. We commend the humanitarian work being done by the UN personnel under very difficult and challenging conditions to save lives, which is an expression of their unwavering commitment to the values of human dignity and international solidarity. We mourn those who died victim of this conflict and express our heartfelt condolences to the bereaved families in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and beyond. Excellencies, Angola recognized the pertinent role of the United Nations in seeking universal solutions based on its Charter's major principles of international relations, namely, sovereign equality of all its members, obligation of all the members to settle their dispute by peaceful and amicable means in such a manner as to not endanger or jeopardize the international peace, security, and justice, and fulfill in good faith the obligation assumed by them in accordance with the Charter, tolerance and peaceful coexistence among nations. The current challenges of peace and security in the Middle East demonstrate the urgency of prioritizing the search for a fair and sustainable solution based on the application of the relevant United Nations resolutions and international law with the aim of achieving the two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security within international recognized borders. The United Nations remains the best hope and the last frontier for peacemaking and peacekeeping to prevent conflicts and settle international disputes. However, today's global challenges reinforce Angola's conviction about the urgent need to reform the United Nations system, especially its Security Council, to make it effective, representative, and inclusive, and able to strengthen multilateralism as the way of dealing with common and interconnected threats and preserving all the peace and security. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Angola. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, Finland aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We have condemned the cowardly terrorist attack by Hamas against civilians in Israel in the strongest terms. Now, in only 3 weeks, over 10,000 people in Israel and the Palestinian territory have lost their lives in the attack and the escalation that has followed. We are deeply saddened by all this human suffering. Civilians, including women, children, the elderly, have once again paid the highest price. We stress that international humanitarian law must always be respected by all parties to a conflict, and all civilians must be protected in all situations. Security belongs to all. Finland recognizes the right of Israel to protect its civilian population, but we strongly underline that military operations must be proportionate and in line with international humanitarian law. All possible measures to spare civilian lives must be taken in all situations. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held in Gaza and commend the role that the UN, Egypt, Qatar, and other countries in the region have once again played. We supported the Canadian amendment to the resolution presented on Friday. The amendment would have been important and truthful in clearly mentioning the responsibility of Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. Because the amendment was not adopted, we unfortunately had to abstain on the resolution, despite agreeing with most of its highly relevant and carefully formulated content. We thank the Arab Group for all their work in building consensus on this extremely important and urgent issue. We urge the Security Council to assume its responsibility under the Charter and adopt a resolution as soon as possible. The already catastrophic situation is deteriorating as we speak. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is indeed catastrophic. International humanitarian law protects objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as food, water, medical supplies, shelter, as well as electricity and fuel. The civilian population of Gaza, including the children and women, of whom 50,000 are estimated to be pregnant, is in desperate need of all this. We call for continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. All necessary means, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs, must be employed to facilitate the delivery of more aid with utmost urgency. Our great appreciation goes to the UN and other humanitarian actors and their staff for their crucial work, often at the risk of their own lives. Efforts to discredit the UN and the other humanitarian personnel are unacceptable. A joint international effort to de-escalate and to prevent further escalation is needed. The developments in the West Bank are going in the opposite direction. Israel has the legal obligation to protect civilians also from the violence of Israeli citizens residing in the settlements, which are all illegal under international law. We greatly appreciate the diplomatic role that the Secretary General Guterres, the countries in the region, as well as the United States have played on the ground. We commend Egypt for the important initiative to host the Peace Summit. All diplomatic efforts are of great value. We highlight the constructive role and commitment to non-violence of the Palestinian Authority. The role that the Palestinian Authority has played and continues to play as the partner for the entire international community should be commended and respected. The situation again highlights that the only sustainable way to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a negotiated two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. The solution must meet Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty, end the occupation that began in 1967, and resolve all permanent status issues. Gaza and the West Bank must be considered as one entity in order to create a viable Palestinian state. We, as the international community, must bear our responsibility by making the strongest possible push for negotiations as soon as it becomes possible. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland. And now we have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers tomorrow at 3 p.m. in this hall. The details of the program will be announced in the Journal of the United Nations. The meeting is adjourned.